Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the first session of the fall series of the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. I'm very happy to welcome everybody and welcome many of you back. Today we're going to talk about Hegel and contradiction. So I'm very happy to welcome two speakers, Dina Emundts and Michaela Mordinon. We will begin with a talk from Dina Emundts and then a response from Michaela Mordinon. And then I'll give some time for a short response to the response back to Dina Emundts, after which I'll open the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raise hand function, and I'll call on you in the order that the hand appears. If that's not working, feel free to use the chat, either to type in your question or to message me. Please, if you at all can, turn on your cameras, if at all possible, just so we can all see each other. And at the end of the official session, we will leave the room open for a more informal chat about Hegel and contradiction. Okay, so Dina Emundts is professor at the Institute for Philosophy at the Freie Universität Berlin. Her expertise is in systematic philosophy and history of philosophy, especially in the case of the latter, Kant, German idealism, phenomenology, and early modern. Among her publications are the monograph Erfahren und Erkennen, Hegels Theorie der Wirklichkeit, published in 2012, and I think republished this year in the second edition. And from 2021, the article Kant and Hegel on Time in the collected volume Kantian Legacies in German Idealism, edited by Gerard Gentry and published in 2021. And today her talk will be entitled Hegel on Contradiction. I'm going to introduce our second speaker now as well. So our second speaker is Michaela Mordinon. She is professor of metaphysics at the Universidade Federal do ABC in Brazil. Her expertise is in logic and metaphysics in classical German philosophy, with a particular interest in Hegel's dialectic and his conception of logic and contradiction. And she's also been looking at the relation between formal and speculative logic. So she has a range of publications on this very topic. So I'll just mention two. There's the article published in 2019 in the Hegel Bulletin entitled Hegel, a Dialetheist, or a Dialetheist, Truth and Contradiction in Hegel's Logic. And from 2013 in the Hegel Jahrbuch, Contradiction or Not Contradiction, This is the Problem. Okay, so I'm very happy to welcome everybody and welcome you both. And I hand the floor over to Dina Emundts. Who we may have lost. Dina Emundts, are you there? Ah, she's coming back now. She was disconnected. Okay, there she is. Dina Emundts, are you?
I'm sorry, it never happened before. I just was out. I don't know for what reason. I'm at the university, so the internet connection should be good here, but yeah. Okay, hopefully that will be the last time for today.
No problem. Good timing on your return because the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, thank you. I would like to thank Karin and all of you for coming. Yeah, I just try to share my slides, and it's that I read my talk, and sometimes you can read what I say with the slides. So that makes, I try to do this because then it's sometimes easier, at least if sometimes there you have something written. So you can just only listen, or you sometimes read what is on the slides. So let's try to do this. Now because of the, so here we are. Okay, can you see it? Okay, great. So in this talk, I would like to discuss some aspects of Hegel's concept of contradictions. I will be crude rather than subtle in detail in my talk today, because I want to discuss some theses that are chiefly related to the larger picture of the role of contradiction in Hegel, that cannot be clarified by detailed analysis alone. The starting point of my consideration is the observation that the topic of contradiction is relevant in Hegel at different places. Logic, philosophy and realphilosophy are to be mentioned here. This seems important to me, not only because a single representation is then quickly subject to foreshortening. In my eyes, and this is now here, in my eyes, it is rather important to recognize that the topics that Hegel has in mind with Widerspruch can be kept apart, yet they are undoubtedly genuinely connected for him. These topics include at least the following: the principle of excluded contradiction in formal logic, contradictions in the concepts or of concepts that can play a role in the development of the connection between concepts, and philosophical theses on philosophical concepts such as causality and the essence of things, and then phenomena or things in the world that are structured in a way in which elements play a role that appear contradictory. An example for such a real thing is our modern state. Recognizing that the topics can be kept apart is important for the following reason. First, since although Hegel thinks that the themes are closely connected, we can distinguish them. Thus, we can also find without any problems some of Hegel's claims more plausible than others, even though Hegel sees them as closely connected. Second, how these themes are indeed connected for Hegel is a contentious and important question of interpretation. The question ultimately depends also on the question, first, how logic is internally constructed, and second, what the relationship is between real philosophy and logic. These questions are distinct from theses about contradiction, but the answers will also have an impact on what we say about contradiction and how we present it. For this reason, I see my consideration about contradiction in a close relation to a methodological claim. Contradiction is a topic with respect to which there are different possible approaches. And often the approach one chooses hangs together with the view that one adopts of Hegel's main philosophical thesis. Because this is so, it is important and revealing to give an account of the possible ways of access. If we present contradictions as primarily logical topic, that will give this topic another drive than if we start from, let's say, political philosophy. In what follows, I go through the various thematic contexts. That is, first, the logical principle, then the philosophical thesis, and then third, the real philosophy. And starting from each of them, elaborate a bit on the theme of contradiction. Then I will try to draw some conclusions from them and open them up for discussion. Note that in the following, I will often use various abbreviations for the formal logical principle, such as I sometimes say theorem of contradiction or theorem of non-contradiction or theorem of excluded contradiction, all meaning the same, namely this principle or theory of contradiction. So I come to the first part, the logical principle of contradiction in the logic of essence. In order to find out what Hegel's conception of contradiction is, one can start from the part of the logic of essence, and here from the part about identity. Hegel discusses identity and its relation to difference, opposition, and contradiction. The main point of this passage seems to be that we need to see the principle of non-contradiction as dependent on the principle of identity and other principles, and vice versa. This is, I think, quite indisputable, one of the points that Hegel really wants to make. The point is by no means trivial. If we want to develop a philosophical concept of contradiction, we must, according to Hegel, see that it builds a nexus with the concepts of identity, difference, and opposition. This is an interesting methodological thesis about philosophical concepts, and it says something insightful about their coherence. It is not clear, however, what other theses are to be asserted by this indisputably interesting punchline. Above all, one has to ask what it means that Hegel sounds as if he wants to give up the logical principle of contradiction. It does not seem to me to be a good suggestion of interpretation that Hegel actually simply wants to give up the theorem of contradiction. This very briefly for two reasons. First, this would have to have a different consequence for Hegel's own philosophy. He would then have to claim simply that we can ascribe contradictory determinations of a thing, and this is obviously, for example, in the chapter about perception in the phenomenology, not the case. Second, Hegel's philosophical examples of contradictions are always such that they ultimately allow us to assume respects or movements within which the opposing determinations can be located as moments. Thus, he acts in his philosophy and considerations in a way that is in accordance with the principle of non-contradiction. One could perhaps also add to these two reasons a third one, namely that in any case, it rarely really amounts to simply giving up something in Hegel. But then how can Hegel's remark be understood? At this point, I think it is important to distinguish between the principle or logical theorem of contradiction and contradictions. The theorem of contradiction, I think Hegel wants to reveal primarily as an abstraction. It is formally valid, but by itself, it does not help much or not very far to determine things or anything in reality. Hegel's logic presents this abstract principle in its context and thereby uncovers the relativeness of its meaning. The understanding which Hegel associates with a certain philosophical attitude, found especially but not only in Kant, mistakenly thinks that the theorem of contradiction is absolutely suitable for determining something. That also means when the understanding finds determinations that present themselves as contradictions, it refuses to pursue these contradictions further. One could also say, and this is now again on the handout, one could also say in its dealings with the world, the understanding fails to recognize the significance of the formal character of the theorem of contradiction. About this meaning, namely about the formal character, Hegel's logic enlightens the understanding. That Hegel does not mean that we can simply assert contradictory things becomes clear, for example, when Hegel says at the end of his logic, quotation, the understanding has easy work to claim everything that is said of the idea as contradictory in itself. And then he continues, the understanding which sets about the idea is the double misunderstanding. And the quotation continues in such a way that it is clear that when one differentiates aspects and considers contexts, there is precisely no longer a contradiction in the strict sense. The understanding is in the end wrong in its claim that it is contradictory. So here Hegel follows the theorem of contradiction, the theorem that contradictions cannot be asserted. However, It also becomes clear at the same time that in Hegel's eyes, it is important to take seriously these elements that appear as contradictions. I will elaborate more on this later. Here, it is first of all important to critically consider the formulation of the thesis of mine. The thesis could be that there is a shortened epistemological perspective, which Hegel also states as that of the understanding, in which something appears contradictory, which, reasonably considered, is not a contradiction. In my view, however, this is not quite accurately formulated. It seems to me more appropriate to say that there are contradictory determinations in the occurrence of which the understanding is led to deny that they exist on the basis of the formal theorem of excluded contradiction. If, in opposition to the understanding, we are aware of the character of the logical theorem, then we can take up these contradictory determinations in a movement of thought in which, on the one hand, it becomes clear that there are indeed contradictory determinations, but in which, on the other hand, it is recognized that they fit all into a movement or dynamic. For this reason, it also becomes clear that the formal principle of contradiction does not really oppose this determination at all, but that the contradictory elements in the determinations are, if we comprehend them in the right philosophical way, compatible with it. This formulation has the advantage that one can hold on to the fact that for Hegel contradictory elements are somehow existing, can be comprehended and must not be denied. But that on the other hand, he also wants to show that contradictions, that is, the assertion that the contradictory properties can both exist in the very same respects and perspectives, have to be excluded and resolved. I would like to pause again here and reflect on what I have said. I have called the logical principle of contradiction an abstraction. And against this background, I have claimed that it has only a limited function in the determination of things. But as a formal principle, it can claim validity. So I considered the logical principle of contradiction in the context of the real determination of objects and of the real world. Another possibility is the following. It seems clear that Hegel here, namely in the passage in the logic of essence, wants to consider the relation of logical principles to each other, and that he wants to say that they each require each other in order to be asserted. One could then say here that this is a meta theory. If I want to clarify philosophically what the theorem of contradiction is, I have to clarify, for example, its relation to the theorem of identity. Here one could say that this leaves the validity of the theorem of contradiction itself completely untouched, and that the theses are just a kind of philosophical meta-reasoning. However, it is not quite that simple. If one asks, namely, how this meta-philosophical clarification itself works, then it turns out that here also one cannot simply apply the theorem of non-contradiction. This is because the principles of thought, like the one of identity and the one of non-contradiction, are presented by Hegel as contradicting each other. In the philosophical meta-theory, this apparently does not count as a problem. I think the principles are indeed contradictory to each other according to Hegel. However, this does not pose a problem if here one does not too simply follow the theorem of excluded contradiction, but takes into account the movement and dynamics of the connections of the principles. Oh, sorry, this was a quotation I skipped. That is, Hegel's point here is that the connection of principles of thought is nothing where one can get by, where one can get by simply with abstract logical principles. The theorem of non-contradiction as a guiding principle of thinking would be misplaced here because we have to see the logical principles as moments in a dynamic totality in which contradictory elements can occur without that this is contradicting the abstract principle of non-contradiction. If one goes that way, one can claim that Hegel restricts the validity of the theorem of non-contradiction with respect to special philosophical questions, but one can still validity accept the theorem of contradiction as a principle of thought with which we can think real things of the world or empirically given things. This is, by the way, how I understand Karin de Boer, though what she develops is much more sophisticated. I think these considerations about the fact that the theorem of contradiction cannot claim its absolute validity everywhere is correct. But from other considerations, I would regard the validity as limited also with respect to the determination of real objects. I have already indicated this, and it will play a role again later. Against the absolute validity of the theorem of contradiction, one can argue, in my eyes, both starting from real philosophy and starting from the philosophy of logic as a kind of meta-theory of thinking. My considerations in this part, therefore, also have a methodological point. One must, in any case, I think, contextualize the part of the logic of essence about the formal logical principles of thought in Hegel's philosophy. It can be contextualized with regard to logic and philosophy as a kind of meta-reasoning and with regard to real philosophy. In my eyes, both are necessary. So with this, I come to the second part, philosophy and logic as philosophy and their relation to contradictions. Hegel treats the subject of contradiction in logic. There too, he does this in various ways, which ultimately belong together, he believes. On the one hand, there are paragraphs here that refer directly and explicitly to the theorem of contradiction. I addressed these in the last part. On the other hand, the contradiction and contradictory determinations also play an important role in other places of the logic. Firstly, the sense that contradictions or contradictory determinations are also in the sense that contradictions or contradictory determinations are also asserted elsewhere. And secondly, this seems to play an important role in the method of developing concepts. In terms of the latter, one can look at the course of the logic and ask to what extent Hegel characterizes the concepts through contradictory determinations and to what extent this motivates their progress. For example, one could say for the beginning of the logic that according to Hegel, it is both mediated and unmediated, and that this determines Hegel's ongoing in the logic, namely showing mediations in what has been presented at the beginning. In fact, I think this is a good example of contradiction, since I think Hegel wants to declare both propositions to be true. The proposition that the logic is mediated at the beginning and the proposition that it is unmediated. Although we can take this as an example for contradictions, this does not mean that Hegel justifies with this case that working with contradictions is a good philosophical method. This meta-philosophical assumption about the role of contradictions is supposed to only be justified by the whole of the logic. If we take this case, that is the two propositions about the beginning of the logic, as an example, we can see again that Hegel does not want to deny the formal theory of non-contradiction in this case. This is for the following reason. We spell out these two true propositions according to Hegel in such a way that the beginning of the logic is, on the one hand, unmediated in various respects, and that, on the other hand, it is mediated in other respects. That is, what we spell out is precisely not in contradiction to the theorem of non-contradiction. The beginning of logic, for example, is unmediated in the sense that it will prove to be one in which no external prepositions have to be made. It is at the same time mediated because the proof that it is unmediated can only be made by showing step by step, mediating, that all presuppositions can be derived internally. Not only does this not contradict the theorem of contradiction, but it is also clear what is often abstracted from in cases of misuse of the theorem of non-contradiction. We abstract from the duration and the extension of what is determined, but above all, also from the duration and extension of the process of determining. Both are movements or dynamics in which contradictory determinations can certainly occur as moments. Hegel does not limit this idea of tracing the dynamics of contradictory determinations to the beginning of the logic. Rather, in accordance with this method of tracing contradictory determinations, he develops concepts and principles and their relationship to each other in the logic as a whole. He actually seeks contradictory determinations and develops them in such a way that they become moments of a movement that encompasses them. This method is to be justified, as I said, at the end of the logic or as the logic as a whole, or rather it justifies itself by its success at the end. So I skipped a passage where I distanced from Stephen Holgate. In this context of the question of the extent to which philosophy and logic work with contradictions, Hegel's debate with Kant can be located particularly well. Concerning Hegel's relation to Kant, the distinction of real and logical oppositions within Kant can be the starting point. The amphiboly of reflection can also be a starting point, and the antinomies can be a starting point, all in relation to Kant. It is important that with all this, we locate Hegel's discussion of contradictions in a meta-philosophical discussion about philosophy and its method. Starting from the third antinomy, we can say, for example, the following. According to Kant himself, the problem lies in the concept causality. So this is in a way now my interpretation of the third antinomy, and to put very short. So according to Kant himself, the problem lies in the concept causality. Taken as a principle of structuring or synthesizing, there is no problem with causality. But if we have to say what this concept fully means, we cannot avoid contradictions. According to Kant's antinomy, the concept of causality implies the idea of an infinite given chain, which contains a contradiction, or the idea of a cause of itself, which is also according to Kant, a contradiction. Whereas these considerations that there are contradictions lead Kant to the claim that we really cannot say more about the concept of causality, Hegel suggests that we have to think somehow through these contradictions. Only then, according to Hegel, can we really understand what causality is. With this, he does not want to say that we have to accept a contradictory concept, but he wants to claim that we can make sense of these moments that look like contradictions. They do look like contradictions only as long as one doesn't add more levels and structural elements. We can, for example, see that an infinite given chain has in the end to be understood as a circle of determinations that we develop in thinking, and that there is no logical contradiction between being given and being infinited then. I don't want to go into details here, but I think the idea is already clear. There are philosophical concepts that have contradictory determinations that makes the concepts look contradictory as long as we look at them in a way that is too simple. Another example of this line of thinking that starts with Kant and leads to a criticism of Kant from Hegel's side is given by Karin de Boer. One of her main theses is that what Hegel that what Hegel wants to capture with his discussion of contradictions is that we cannot treat philosophical concepts such as essence and appearances in the manner we treat empirical objects. For the standpoint of the understanding, essence and appearances look like contradictory concepts that build strict alternatives in our relation to the world. But as philosophers, according to Hegel, we have to understand that this contradiction is not fruitful in the discussion of how we can cognize the world and has to be overcome. In this section, I have considered various examples of philosophical concepts where, according to Hegel, a wrong use of the formal theorem of contradiction has disastrous consequences for the philosophical conception. This does not contradict the formal validity of the principle of non-contradiction. It is just that one cannot naively apply it in certain philosophical contexts. Thus, we can keep the theorem of contradiction and contradictory determinations in philosophical terms separate. However, bearing in mind what I have said in passing about the logic, we could add the following. The theorem of contradiction arises as valid from a method that already is the productive work with contradictory determinations. For Hegel, the theorem of non-contradiction is not simply valid as a law of thought, as we would maybe say, but we have to justify it. Hegel thus assumes here a kind of founding of the logically formal principle through the philosophical method of determination through contradictions. This is one of the points at which Hegel establishes a connection between the various subject areas in which we do not have to join from systematic point of view. This is because, as I stressed at the beginning, we can separate the thematic context. This brings me to the last context, and this is contradictions in the real world. Contradictory determinations also play a role in Hegel's Realphilosophie. It is, I think, not too much to say that according to Hegel, one can adequately describe most of the structures of our reality only if one describes them in a way in which contradictory determinations play an essential role. Note that here I have a broad and loose concept of contradiction. One even might get the impression that all this has nothing to do with the logical principle. In a way, that is true, namely in the sense that one could find all this convincing without thinking at all of the logical principle. However, as already mentioned, this is not what Hegel maintains because he positively wants to link these different contexts of the topic of contradictions. I think we really can say that for Hegel, everything that exists is structured in a way with respect to which we can speak of contradictory determinations. First of all, I have to say what I mean here with everything. Everything that represents a unity over time, that is, has a duration. So everything does not mean all sensations and occurrences, but everything that somehow has duration and unity, and in this sense also can count as an object. What is meant then is first of all that such a something has a structure in which oppositions, contrasts, and tension occur, and that these also belong to what this something is. Hegel assumes that the latter, that something exists as such, is only possible if these oppositions stand in a certain relationship to each other, which is a kind of mediation. Hegel finds it semantically appropriate to speak here of contradictions and negations. From the outset, this raises a question of the extent to which logic and language are involved here. I already said that the concept of contradictions I use first of all with respect to Realphilosophie is a very broad concept and not a specific logical one. However, even if we disregard the theorem of non-contradiction, it is not clear what the expression contradiction and to contradict mean, and I want to discuss this a little bit. I would like to state one can adopt a speech of contradict and negate in which these expressions neither refer to a logical nor to a linguistic act. For example, one can say that the satisfaction of a need negates or contradicts that of another person. One person does something that restricts the other's freedom, and this restriction is called a contradiction or negation. We can note here that contradiction means also negation, or we say that to negate, and that this can mean restriction or limitation. However, here, widersprechen and negieren are kinds of action. Even if one also includes non-linguistic actions under this, they seem to be intentional actions in any case. To say that life is made up of contradictory moments goes a step further than to say that a person contradicts with its action another person, as it is questionable whether any action is being taken here in the case of life. It is therefore also beyond any logical connotation a perfectly legitimate question whether Hegel really means objects themselves or real things are, in this broad meaning, contradicting each other or themselves. What he seems to have in mind here is maybe more real oppositions or resistance. A classical real opposition, according to Kant, is the opposition of forces, of which the effects stand in opposite. For Hegel, this would surely be an example, and I think a very good example for contradictions in this broad sense. However, real oppositions do also not fit in all cases, because the human action seem to be of a different kind. One might suspect that Hegel uses the vocabulary to contradict and to negate in such an expansive way, precisely because he does not want to reserve activity and directedness for human actions alone. He seems to see structural analogies between all these cases. I would thus like to suggest that for Hegel, contradiction in the broad sense means not only to contradict or to negate or to oppose, but it also can mean to resist. It is this thesis that everything is structured by resistance, tensions, oppositions, and contradictory elements that I want to consider. Still, independent of what this means with regard to the logical theorem of non-contradiction, the question arises as to what this is supposed to mean. What does Hegel mean with the thesis that there are these contradictory elements, and why is this important? I assume that for Hegel, the thesis that everything is structured by opposites is to be a metaphysical truth, by which I mean a truth about the structure of the world. Another important thesis of Hegel is that the understanding cannot grasp this structure. Accordingly, the thesis has an epistemological dimension. The structure of things can only be comprehended if we are able to grasp something as a movement in which contradictory elements can be integrated. Hegel is probably not only saying that the world is structured in this way, but also that this structure is necessary for something that is a unity over time. The latter, namely the claim about the necessity, is probably a thesis he wants to show in his logic. So I leave this aside here. However, that things have contradictory determinations and that this is essentially part of them is something that could also be seen through Hegel's description of phenomena. There are a lot of examples of entities that are constituted into unity through contradictory determinations. Prominent examples by Hegel are social and political institutions, the state, or at least the modern state, for example, life, perception, recognition, freedom, time would be another example. At least in part, it is obvious that tensions are constitutive here. In the case of recognition, for example, it is obvious that the other must contradict in order for one's own identity to be formed. In the case of freedom, too, Hegel's description refers convincingly to the theme of contradiction. For example, when one says that the foundation of freedom in the state as a general is the prerequisite for individual freedom. Those are examples for which Hegel's idea of contradiction, at least understood in the broad and loose sense, is doubtless fruitful. I would like to briefly elaborate here on the example of perception, because this example concerns the question that arose earlier about the extent to which contradictory determinations must already be conceded in the case of empirical objects. Perception of perceptual things in the second chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit is one example for that things have contradictory determinations. In this chapter of perception, Hegel says, for example, that der Widerspruch am gegenständlichen Wesen ist, so that the object of perception have a contradiction in itself, or the objects have a contradiction in themselves. Most interpreters tend to think that contradictions are only in the conception or the conceptions of the consciousness, and that this is a reason why this position has to be given up. I don't agree. In my eyes, the problem lies in the fact that the perceptual consciousness cannot comprehend that and how a thing can be constituted by contradictory determinations. This does not mean that there are no contradictory elements, but rather only that we need another philosophical framework to deal with them. I think that perception as well as a perceived thing are for Hegel items that have contradictory elements, and in a way they have to be described in a manner in which contradictory determinations play a role. If we want to say what perception is, we have to say that it is passive and active, and that it is immediate and mediated. Additionally, the perceived is a unity and it is a plurality. We have to say that the thing is constituted by properties and that the properties are together due to the thing. As I said before, all this does not mean that we contradict the theorem of non-contradiction and that we have to get rid of this theorem. Rather, we can comprehend how these determinations hang together when we consider that the perceived thing and the perception are dynamic. For this reason, I would say that when Hegel says in the logic of essence that all things are themselves contradictory, we have to understand this in a double sense. On the one hand, this is not Hegel's own position, but it is a position of the understanding. This is what Karin de Boer spelled out in her interpretation. According to Hegel, we cannot simply and without any further move claim that things are in themselves contradictory. On the other hand, I would say after all that Hegel could claim this with an explication that being contradictory here does not mean that things have contradictory properties in the very same respects. Instead, it means that they have contradictory determinations that play the role of compatible moments in the whole story. Thus, if we take into account different respects, we can say that things are contradictory and that they are not contradictory. So I come to the end of my talk with some concluding remarks. I have started from three thematic complexes in order to say something about the topic of contradictions from each of them. In my eyes, these are three possible ways of approaching the subject, and with each of them, one can get a better grip on different aspects. I already said at the beginning that Hegel sees these themes in a close connection with each other, but that it is disputed what exactly this connection should look like. I have already indicated that one of Hegel's claims about the connection, which one might not want to share, could be that of a foundation of the logical theorem of contradiction through the method of philosophical logic working with contradictions. I would like now to add to this idea the following two things. So first, it seems to me that Hegel is indeed primarily concerned with the comprehension of the world, which is not possible without dealing with contradictory determinations. While this leaves the logical theorem of contradiction intact as something with which we can do certain logical operations, it at the same time refers this abstract theorem of contradiction to a restricted sphere. Now, after after what I have said, one might perhaps have the impression that I'm actually limiting the sphere of validity of the logical principle too much. According to my explanation, can one do anything else with the theorem than performing purely logical operations? The impression, sorry, this is on the Hegel sees, the impression can easily arise that one cannot do more, because I wanted to distinguish Realphilosophie precisely as the sphere in which contradictory determinations must be recognized. Here one could conclude that the theorem of contradiction cannot be applied here in the real world at all. However, I didn't want to get that far. This theorem, sorry. I think it is here. Here at the end, this theorem also can be applied to everyday things, and it can be important to follow the theorem of non-contradiction when dealing with them, namely when dealing with everyday things or with empirical things. In order to do so, one must indeed behave towards things in a way that one can characterize as abstract. For example, something can clearly belong to me. Thus, it is not the case that at the same time and in exactly the same respect, it belongs to me and that it does not belong to me. One can also want to stipulate this belonging in a contract. If I want to determine something concretely, however, I will additionally switch to distinguishing aspects. Thus, even in view of what the contract states correctly but abstractly, I can say that something belongs to me in one respect, but it does not belong to me in another. The abstract and the concrete determination can both play a role in our life. Second remark, also with regard to Realphilosophie and the contradictions that occur here, one can ask how these relate to the two different contexts of the theme of contradiction in the logic. A common interpretation is, or would probably say, that Hegel sees the logical method of determination by tracing contradictory determinations as foundational, not only for the theorem of contradiction, but also, or even more, for understanding the contradictory determinations of Realphilosophie. I would not agree, but this is a topic for another talk. In any case, I would again point out that these contexts can also be kept separate, unlike Hegel wanted. Furthermore, in line with what I've said in my first part, I want to suggest here that in order to comprehend the logical theorem of non-contradiction and its abstract character, we don't have to study the logic. We can also deal with the contradictions in Realphilosophie. In Realphilosophie, we see, for example, that a Verstandesstaat is a state in which people do not comprehend that the modern state has a contradictory determinations of individual freedom and the universal state, and that this insight in that both elements build a state is not available if we have an abstract understanding of contradictions. Thus, that it makes sense to deal with contradictory elements can not only be seen from the logic, but also from the standpoint of Realphilosophie. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that very rich and interesting talk. So I now pass the floor over to Michaela Mordinon.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karin, for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to present some comments to Dina's talk. And thank you, Dina, for sharing the draft of the paper with me in advance. It is a really insightful and stimulating paper. I've been working on this topic for a long time, and this gives a new view and a perspective on the topic. So I will try to say something interesting about some of the points that you presented. So I think I will start with the validity of the law of non-contradiction, okay? So I would like to focus on your initial question. One has to ask, what does it mean that Hegel sounds as if he wants to give up the logical principle of contradiction? So I think we need to answer which version of the law of contradiction we are talking about. So we are talking about the ontological version of the law of contradiction, the semantic one, the pragmatic one. I think that determining this point is extremely important to understand if and to what extent and what type of law of non-contradiction we are problematizing. In order to answer this question, we also need to define what does the contradiction pertain to. So it pertains to proposition, logical determination, the philosophical discourse on the content of the determination, and which kind of discourse, which kind of thought, the one of the understanding or the one of reason. Or does the contradiction pertains to things in themselves? And then we face the big problem of interpreting Hegel's famous claim of the doctrine of essence that all things are inherently contradictory, which you mentioned during your talk. Of course, as you said during your talk, it's not easy to answer this question because Hegel writes about contradiction in different contexts, and the notion of contradiction assumes different meanings depending on the context in which it is involved in the system. In some parts of your talk, you seem to refer to the ontological conception of contradiction, and you seem to claim that Hegel wants to save the validity on the ontological version of the law. For example, you claim, and I quote, this, the rejection of the law, would have to have a different consequence for Hegel's own philosophy. He would have to claim simply that we can ascribe contradictory determination to a thing, and this is obviously not the case. In other parts of your talk, you seem to claim that when Hegel is talking about contradiction, he's not really using the notion of contradiction in a technical way, because contradiction basically can be resolved through the parametrization strategy. For example, when you claim, and I quote, Hegel's philosophical example of contradictions are always such that they ultimately allow us to assume respects and movement within which the opposing determination can be located as moments, end of quote. And then there are also some parts of the talk where you claim that contradiction is something affecting the thought of the understanding. Just one little part of your talk. The understanding mistakenly thinks that the theorem of contradiction is absolutely suitable for determining something. And that also means what the understanding finds determination that present themselves as contradiction, it refuses to pursue this contradiction further. One could also say in its dealing with the word, the understanding fails to recognize the significance of the formal character of the theorem of contradiction. So I try to resume. If I got you right, what turns out to be really contradictory is the abstract comprehension of the understanding that tries to avoid contradiction, and not the speculative thought of reason that, let's say, can integrate the contradictory determination in a non-contradictory unity through some sort of distinction of respects. And then I come to the most interesting point of your talk for me. So when you seem to claim that the law of non-contradiction has a limited validity. So I quote, it is formally valid, but by itself, it does not help much or not very far to determine things or anything in reality. Hegel's logic presents this abstract principle in its context and thereby uncovers the relativeness of its meaning. Okay. Or again, in And this point for me is particularly interesting when you say, and I quote again, I have called the logical principle of contradiction and abstraction. And against this background, I have claimed that it has only a limited function in the determination of things, end of quote. So now you are defining, seems to me, that you are trying to define the context in which Hegel seems to claim that we need to speak of contradictory determinations for explaining how things are. And this context would be the determination of object of the real, in the real world, in the actual reality. And another important point you seem to, for you, there's the distinction that seems to be fundamental, the law of non-contradiction and contradictions. I don't know if I got you right, but my impression is that you are saying that Hegel, as anyone else actually, in order to say something determinate, needs to endorse the formal theorem of contradiction. Okay, so we need to consider that this point in a certain way undermines or risk to undermine his pretension to elaborate a philosophical proposal which is free from any kind of presupposition. Hence, we don't have to take him seriously when he claims that philosophy, in order to be science, needs to be completely free from any kind of presupposition. Moreover, another problematic point, the validity of the law of non-contradiction seems to be, in your view, not only formal, because in the first part of the talk you say, and I quote, he acts in his philosophy and consideration in a way that is in accordance with the principle of non-contradiction, I quote, end of quote. But in the second part, you seem to make a stronger claim when you say, and I quote, for Hegel, the theorem of non-contradiction is not simply valid as a law of thought. Hegel does assume here a kind of founding of the logical formal principle through the philosophical method of determination through contradictions, end of quote. So it seems to me that there is a sense in which contradictions need to be overcome, not just for formal reason. At the same time, there are other parts of the talk, and here I go back to the problem of the limited validity of the law, okay? And you say, I quote, I think that this consideration about the fact that the theorem of contradiction cannot claim its absolute validity is correct. But from other consideration, I would regard the validity as limited also with respect to the determination of real object. So my question is the following. The principle of contradiction is a formal principle. And in its standard conception, it is not meant to concretely determine how things are in the world in actual reality. Therefore, if we think that Hegel is affirming that the law of non-contradiction has a validity which is not absolute or which is limited because the principle does not allow to account for the way things are in the world, then Hegel ends up making a kind of criticism that does not seem to be so problematic, because there is no limitation in the validity of the law of non-contradiction in saying that it is not a sufficient condition for determining the thing, how things are in actual reality, because the law of non-contradiction is not, in its standard conception, is not supposed to account for how things are in the actual world, and that's why I asked at the beginning to which version of the law you are referring to. So as long as I understood how things works with the law of non-contradiction in its ontological version, the only thing that the law of non-contradiction, the ontological law of non-contradiction excludes is the possibility for something to have opposite properties. But in your reading, Hegel does not mean in any way to admit that such a kind of possibility can occur. And so Hegel, despite his criticism, does not really have any problem with the validity of the law, it seems to me, at least in your reading. But again, I don't know if I got you right, and I would like to hear something more about this, okay? And I agree with your claim that according to Hegel, the law of contradiction has a limited validity, but I argued for this thesis on the basis of stronger reason, I think, because in my reading, I think he wants to claim the negation of the law of contradiction, and this is equivalent to say that there are some contradiction, or from a semantic point of view, I think that Hegel claims that some contradiction are true. But then I should explain which are these contradictions that are true and what does it mean that they are true. But fortunately, this is another story. And fortunately, today I don't have to give a talk about this. Okay. But another point, you distinguish the law of contradiction and contradiction. On the one hand, you claim that Hegel does not give up the law. But on the other hand, you say that he needs contradiction in order to account for the way things are. My impression, but tell me if I'm wrong, is that these two claims are compatible insofar as what you mean by contradictions that are fundamental for accounting for the constitution of things in actual reality are not really contradictory and does not represent any menace to the role for the role of non-contradiction. So you claim, and I quote, according to Hegel, one can adequately describe most of the structure of our reality only if one describes them in a way in which contradictory determinations plays an essential role. And in another point, you say, I think that we can really say that for Hegel, everything that exists is structured in a way with respect to which we can speak of contradictory determination. End of quote. But in what sense contradictory determination plays an essential role? My impression, again, is that the contradiction you're talking about, a contradiction of the understanding, namely a contradiction affecting an abstract conception of reality, that are resolved when the object of the philosophical investigation is accounted for from the concrete standpoint of reason. So we really don't need actual contradiction, but the contradiction of the understanding would be a sort of symptom of an abstract and one-sided conception of reality. And many interpretation of Hegel's notion of contradiction follows this line. This is quite clear, I think, in the last part of your talk, when you say that, and I quote, I would say that when Hegel says in the logic of essence that all things are in themselves contradictory, we have to understand this in a double sense. On the one hand, this is not Hegel's own position, but it is the position of the understanding. According to Hegel, we cannot simply and without any further move claim that things are in themselves contradictory. On the other hand, I would say, after all, that Hegel could claim this with the explication that being contradictory not means that they have contradictory property in the same respects. And this is the important point, in the same respect. But that they have contradictory determinations that play a role of compatible moments in the whole story. But if they are compatible, they are not contradictory. So I think we can resolve contradiction if we take into account the distinction of respects under which contradictory properties are predicated of the same things. And in the central part of the talk, you correctly point out that the assertion that contradictory properties can both exist in the very same respect that can be resolved. And so you are referring, I think, to the problem of the Aufhebung of contradiction. But the problem for me, it has always been, and it still is, to understand what does it mean that is a contradiction is Aufgehoben. And my impression here is that when you say that the contradictions need to be resolved, you want to claim that what seems to be contradictory is just an apparent contradiction. What's something that looks like a contradiction. For example, when you say, and I quote, he does not want to say that we have to accept contradictory concepts, but he wants to claim that we can make sense of these moments that look like contradictions. They do look like contradiction only as long as one does at more levels and structural elements. Therefore, as you said, concepts like essence and appearance seems contradictory for the understanding, but as philosophers, we need to look at this concept from the standpoint of reason, where this contradictory relation turns out to be overcome. If we take, and that's, I want to say, that means if we make this relation, this apparently contradictory relation explicit, it turns out not to be contradictory anymore. But then my question is this really what the Aufhebung of contradiction is all about? If I assume this reading, wouldn't Hegel be too Kantian? Because Kant himself shows that the contradiction of the antinomies, for example, are just apparent contradictions that can be perfectly resolved if we use the parametrization strategy. And so is this the same strategy that Hegel is using when he wants to solve or resolve contradiction? And then I think I already talked too much. I have a lot of pages of comments on Dina's talk because it really make me think a lot about this topic. I thank again Karin for the invitation and Dina for the opportunity to share some idea with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments and questions. I'm afraid we don't have time for a detailed response on every point, but in any case, we can continue to explore these in the Q&A altogether and in the informal session afterwards. But I will pass the floor now back to Dina Emundts if you have some comments on some of the points that were raised.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that was really very rich and interesting. I really have to read it, so then you can send me maybe some parts at least of it. Yeah, I think there are many very important and interesting points. I think you understood me correctly. I would say that the law of contradiction and the contradiction, that it is helpful to really separate them. Though I won't say that Hegel does not see a close relation between them. But nevertheless, I find this helpful to really understand the formal principle of contradiction on the one hand as something that is then really also a principle of thought, not an ontological principle at first hand, but really a principle of thought. And at the other hand, to really ask, are there contradictions in the broader sense in the world? So I think most of what you said is just correct in summarizing my talk. So, and you're right that sometimes this is very difficult to really to find the right formulation, like you put your finger on that. I said sometimes look like a contradiction, and then you made the convincing point that what does this mean? Is it a contradiction or is it not a contradiction? And in a way, I say, as you said, that yeah, it looks like a contradiction. And now there are two stories. One is of the understanding that really sees the contradiction in the sense of that it has to be avoided. Then there is the perspective of reason, and reason sees contradictory determinations, but sees that they can be combined or are compatible with each other if the explanation is a more complicated one. So I really would say that at first we can start with the situation that things look like contradictions, and then we have these two different perspectives. And I mean, you are also totally right that in a way my interpretation, I mean, you said this on several points, but at the first you said that it's not then very exciting, because that's the principle, that's a formal law. It's not sufficient to determine something. That's what most people would say. So that's not interesting. But I think that in the end, Hegel wants to say that though this might be clear on the one hand, the way people philosophize is different. For example, Kant in the causality discussion, in the essence appearance discussion and all this, he seems to take the formal principle of contradiction much more serious than one might suspect then. And he uses this principle I would agree with Hegel that in the antinomy, the formal principle of contradiction plays an enormous role. And that's then something where Hegel would go in another direction. So I wouldn't agree that Aufhebung there is in the Kantian sense. Hegel does not want to, in the sense, it does not want to avoid these contradictory determinations, but more explain them in a way that they are not contradictory in the sense of the formal law. So yeah, I think you, and also what you said about the difference between understanding and reason, maybe I have to work more with this, because you made clear that maybe it's that on the one hand we have this understanding interpretation of the law of contradiction, and then the reason. Maybe that's helpful to integrate this in my talk. Yeah, I mean, I wrote down a lot because it was so rich. Yeah, maybe we can just start the discussion, and I come back then to some of your points in our discussion. But thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you both for that. And the floor is now open to questions. Feel free to turn on your camera if you can, and use the raise hand function if you have a question. So the first question is from Francois Ottman.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I have one methodological, or rather a meta-philosophical question. I fully agree with your method, consisting in grasping different areas involving the principle of the concepts of contradiction, but I'm wondering if your use of a distinction between a technical concept of contradiction on the one hand and a broader or loose notion of contradiction in the other isn't threatening our understanding of the notion of contradiction. Because then I'm asking myself, what's the unity of the concept of contradiction? And is that a mere analogy? Is that an application of an abstract concept in the real philosophy? Or is that a specification of the concept? Could you please precise the link between the technical concepts and this broader or loose concept for us?
So yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, my idea was that really it's really only a first step. My idea was to really try to separate them. And you are right that, and that's what I also said, that now somehow we lose the unity of the concept contradiction. But I think that Hegel wants to, he has a story about how these different areas are linked to each other. And this story then explains us why it makes sense to talk all the time of contradictions. But this is a story I find very difficult. And I think it's not that easy to analyze. And I think there are a lot of problems in this story of the connection. I mean, if, for example, you say, you know, all what is there is explained in the logic. So this is the grounding thing, we have the logic and all these things, and this explains us what contradictions have to play an essential role in the development, and they explain us how things are combined with each other. They explain us also how we get to the formal principle of contradiction and things like that. And this is the basis for the real philosophy without any doubt. Then I think this is then the story how these different concepts are linked to each other. But I think that this is not, I mean, that you cannot tell the story like this. And for that reason, I think it's better to first separate these concepts. So first I would just answer like this, but it's a good question. It's clear that we need more for the connection to tell us why this is still one conception of contradiction. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next question is from Bernardo Ferro.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Emundts, for a great talk. I have a quick question on the use of contradiction in Hegel's Realphilosophie. So the broad use, as you mentioned. And it relates to this idea that contradictions refer to our accounts of objects, but also to objects or institutions themselves. And so my first question would be, could we then say that just as there are contradictory accounts of everyday objects, there are also contradictory objects in contradictory social institutions, for example, themselves? And I take the example of the Verstandesstaat or the Notstaat, as Hegel also says. So why would the Verstandesstaat be contradictory? Because we know he says that it's not fully rational. It doesn't actualize freedom in the correct way. But why is it contradictory? Is it because it's not what it makes out to be? Is it because it is unable to fulfill its appointed purpose? And I ask this because when we have a contradictory logical proposition, it's easy to see why it's contradictory. We cannot hold it to be true. And if we do so, we're mistaken. So there's an imminent tension in it that leads us to resolve it. So, but when we have a contradictory social institution or practice, that can go on, it can exist historically for centuries sometimes. So there's no imminent imperative to resolve it in the same way that there is an imminent imperative to resolve a contradictory logical proposition. And so can we really talk about contradiction in the same way in that context? That would be my question.
Yeah, great, thank you. I would say yes, and I think that the Verstandesstaat is for Hegel the view that we have two principles, the civil society and the state, and they cannot somehow be combined. And that becomes, but that is now really dependent on my interpretation of the Rechtsphilosophie. So I would say that poverty and rubble is the consequence of that there is this tension in the state. And I would say that this is not, I mean, this is really something people have a big dispute about. But I would say that poverty and rubble is the consequence of the Verstandesstaat. So if you have the right understanding of that contradictory determinations are what makes the state a good state, if they are understood in the right way, then these will vanish. And this means that in this case, you really can get rid of these tensions with the right understanding of contradictory determinations. So I would go this way and say, yes, you see that there is this tension in the Verstandesstaat. Yeah.
Thank you. I would agree, by the way.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
Okay, our next question is from Claudia Wilsing.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you for the presentation. I have two quick questions. My first question refers to the last point of your presentation, and when you talked about metaphilosophical category, and I just want to ask back whether I got something wrong or whether I understood you correctly. You said something like that you cannot then naively apply it to everything in the world, and then you use that phrase metaphilosophical category. And I was just thinking, I wouldn't say that any metaphysical category, even if you have the category of contradiction as a philosophical category, would mean that you have to apply everything to the world. So I would still make a distinction there. Maybe you didn't say that and I got it wrong. Nevertheless, I wanted to ask back whether you think that there is a connection, that one thing means the other thing. And the second thing was about what you said actually about the metaphilosophical category of contradiction, and that you said, well, you know, it cannot be a metaphilosophical category simply because it cannot be applied, for example, to non-contradictory determinations of thought. And if you actually think of the logic of being, for example, then yeah, of course, you cannot have it there, right? It's not, many people would claim there is, it cannot be a main or a meta philosophical category. And I was just wondering, why not? I mean, why can we not really read it like that, especially if we think about what you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation, when you said, well, the way how things are related is a question of how we interpret them. And if you think, and that is merely a question about the logic in itself or the logical truth, when you think about the category of contradiction, then I think that Angelica Nuzzo made a very fruitful distinction. Namely, she said there is a distinction between first truth at the very beginning of the logic, namely that refers to the unity of being and nothing. And then there is a kind of a last truth, she called it. And this kind of last truth is actually the logical development justifying the beginning, so to speak, retrospectively. And then you could claim that the idea of contradiction was always there from the very beginning. It's just that the category in itself or the logical determinations do not have a consciousness about this contradiction. And then you can claim, well, from what Michaela actually said, from a speculative perspective, yeah, of course, then why can the contradiction not be a meta category for all determinations of thought in the logic? But that is a more substantial question. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. So I'm not sure if, actually, in both cases, I'm not really sure if I get your point. I think the first was a misunderstanding. I didn't talk of categories, and maybe also the second is a kind of misunderstanding, but a very interesting one. So thank you. I wanted to say that definitely this method working with contradiction, that's something which is going on in the whole logic. And for Hegel, this is the philosophical method. And it is justified, I would say, in the whole logic, in a way only at the end of the logic. Nevertheless, it plays a role from the beginning. So that I wanted to say. And then I wanted to say, I think that Hegel wants to that Hegel thinks that the formal principle of contradiction follows somehow from this method, so that this is the foundation of this formal principle. I would say, hey, be careful, it could be just a principle of thought, but that's not Hegel's story, that's my story. Yeah. So I wanted to make these things separate, but nevertheless, I see that Hegel has this foundational story. And I agree with you that there, of course, it's a metaphilosophical thing. What I then wanted also to say is, and this refers to the talk I heard from you a while ago, that I think that there are also other things like recognition and all this, where one can also find these, the topic of contradiction. And I wouldn't be so quick to say that, yeah, this is because the logic has this metaphysical story and we have to find the structure everywhere. And so I would like to separate and to say, look, first, these concepts are very different and it's not that clear that we can follow from the one to the other. So I agree with that in this sense, it is metaphilosophical and this has a huge work to play there. Thanks.
Okay, so next question comes from Farhad.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for this interesting topic that you brought up today. So I was thinking about, this might be a very marginal question to your presentation. So I was thinking about the relation between Kant and Hegel here. So I was thinking Kant's notion of real opposition from his pre-critical negative magnitude to the amphibole chapter in the first critique. So I was thinking if there is any existing literature, investigating that area, because it seems very Kantian in some sense, the contradiction principle in itself. So to say, to ascribe this concept of contradiction to things in themselves seems to be Kantian in the sense that you're regarding the reality of the things. For things to be real, there should be a contribution of sensibility in a Kantian sense. You should, and then comes the collision of forces, and the degree of reality and everything. And quite interestingly, it is in the context of that pre-critical text that Kant himself uses the word Aufhebung to explain how real opposition gets cancelled or sublated or anything. So I was thinking how indebted Hegel might be to Kant in that respect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, indeed, I think that this is for Hegel very important, this Kantian idea of real oppositions. And I mean, I don't know if you know that there is a quite old book from Michael Wolf about this. He tries to really make this connection between Kant and Hegel, and has a thesis that Hegel really takes his whole concept of contradiction from this. Michael Wolf is the name. I think this is very interesting, and I have to confess that I have to reread this book. It's a while ago that I've read it, but I think that as far as I remember, I would say that this is a great idea, but he makes in a way too much of it. I think that he tries to understand the whole concept of contradiction that way, whereas I try to make these remarks that this is one sense of contradiction in real philosophy, but I don't see that this is really that dominant in all areas. But nevertheless, I think it's a good point. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a link to the book in the chat. I see that somebody's posted, so thanks for that. And our final question comes from Karin de Boer.
Yes, so thanks a lot for a very interesting talk, and I agree with you in general. So I would like to ask a question that is very similar to Bernardo's, namely on the state, on your example. And maybe two questions on this point, because first of all, to me, it's not very clear what we mean when we say that the philosophy of right deals with the real world. Because he develops a conception of the modern state, of the conditions under which a modern state can be rational, but this is not exactly the same as referring to something that actually exists. So that would be a first step. And then related to this, I'm not so sure that for Hegel there is really a contradiction between individual freedom on the one hand and universal rationality or universal laws, or the principle of universality on the other hand. So I take you to argue that that the two principles appear as contradictory from the perspective of the understanding, and that Hegel's aim is to show that the two principles aren't really contradictory, but are rather complementary, and that is to say, need to be thought together. But I don't find this very satisfactory. Yes, because I think that most people would agree that the principle of individual freedom and the principle of universal laws that apply to everyone, that these two principles are simply complementary. Yeah, so most philosophers would agree that the two principles are simply complementary, and that it's maybe hard to answer the question, how can they be combined? But I don't see Hegel presenting the tension between these two principles as a contradiction. And I think that for Hegel, there is a contradiction at a different level that maybe you did not really address in your talk, namely, but I think that Bernardo also referred to this, namely a contradiction, a kind of internal contradiction between the idea of the modern state on the one hand, that is elaborated in a systematic manner in the philosophy of right, and on the other hand, any particular actually existing state. And I think that, well, at least let me speak for myself, I find it more interesting to think of contradictions as self-contradictions. And I think that that we here have a nice example of how something, namely an actual state, can be contradictory in the sense that its actual existence does not agree with its rational determinations, or with the rational determinations of any modern state. Yeah, do you see what I mean? So I think there are two levels at which the issue of contradiction can be located within the philosophy of right. And as said, I'm not so sure that we can really find it at the level of Hegel's distinction between principles such as individual freedom and universal laws.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. With respect to your to the second point, namely that there is a maybe further interesting case of contradiction between somehow the concept and the realization. I would agree, though maybe not with respect to the same cases, I don't know. But for example, I mentioned life, and I think that for Hegel, this is a sort of tension that we have life at the universal, and then the individuals that are somehow in tension to life, but nevertheless they need each other. And this is also more a two-level contradiction. And that's right, that this does not play a role in my talk. And maybe, I'm not sure if I would agree with respect to the state example, but with respect to some cases, that's definitely true that it has another structure, and that's interesting. I will take this up. I will pick this up and consider what I do with this. In real philosophy, that's it. Yeah, concerning the other point, I mean, that's a good point. Thank you. I think from a systematic point, I think understand what you say, but I would say that Hegel sees there a contradiction, and I think that he would say that this contradiction is a contradiction in the loose sense, and this is a strong tension, maybe better. And this is what was really in history of the states the case. So how the states developed, that played a role, and we still have it in that we have two concepts of freedom, namely the liberal one and the ancient one. And in a way, his own is, in that sense, to pick up both, which seems to be contradictory, but his freedom is then a dynamic concept that can integrate both moments. So I would say that maybe that is too simple, but I would say that he works there with this contradictory idea, and I find it in a way convincing, also with other cases, that there are these contradictory moments that are insightful to take into account. Yeah, and then with respect to the very first thing with the real philosophy, yeah, that's also an interesting point. I would say, but that's really another topic. I would say that this really, that what Hegel does there is to look at real states, but not just like an empirical study, but to look at them and their structure and try to find problems in the structure and things like that.
So that would be a more empiricist approach to
yeah,
the part.
as I said, it's not that his method is empirical. It's of course that I would say that he comes from the logic and he analyzed it, and it's more the standpoint of reason that looks to the things. But nevertheless, I would say that it is that he analyzes real things with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So pretty good timing. That brings the formal part of our session today to a close. So please join me in thanking both of our speakers. So I am putting the link to the program for the subsequent sessions, next of which will be October 6th, into the chat. So please join us, and thank you to our audience and to everybody who's attended and asked questions. Thank you for participating. And as mentioned, we will leave the room open if anybody wants to chat informally. Okay, thank you very much for attending. Thank you for your contributions.